Okay, it's 10 o'clock. Let's get started. So, hi everyone. Thanks for joining today's Learn in 30 webinar. My name is Pierre Harry, and I'm a product specialist with AVEVA Select California. And today we're going to be learning about the AVEVA Edge SQL Connection. So, it's a Learn in 30, so it's pretty short. I'm going to start with a brief PowerPoint to introduce some of the concepts today. And then we're going to dive into the configuration and demonstration of the Edge SQL Connection. And finally, we're going to wrap up with a Q&A to answer all of your questions. So I'm going to ask you guys to wait until the end of the presentation to get your questions answered. But in the meantime, feel free to ask them in the chat and, while they're fresh in your mind, and I'll get to them at the end. So first, let's talk about the two pieces of software that we're going to be working with today. I assume that by signing up to this webinar that all of you guys are familiar with AVEVA Edge, but for those of you that aren't, I'm going to give you guys a brief introduction into the software. So Edge, which was formerly known as Indusoft, is a tool for developing HMI and SCADA systems that is versatile enough to be deployed really anywhere. It is essentially an out-of-the-box, all-in-one solution that can deliver all of your SCADA project needs. Edge has several components that address these SCADA needs. The first one is a project tag database that allows you to manage all of your runtime data strategically by naming and storing different tags that contain that data. This includes all of your PLC I/O data and your internal variables as well. Edge also has hundreds of configurable drivers that allow your project to communicate in real time with PLCs and other I/O devices. With Edge, you can also create your HMI screens and deploy them to the necessary thick or thin clients, depending on your architecture. And finally, Edge has certain modules that also give you the ability to manage your SCADA alarms and events and create trends, reports, and schedules. So now let's talk about the second component of this webinar, which is the SQL Studio itself. So what is SQL Server Studio? And by that matter, what is SQL itself? Well, SQL is structured query language. It's a programming language that is used to manage relational databases and perform certain operations on that data in those repositories. SQL Studio is the integrated environment that allows you to manage your SQL Server. You can use it to configure your different databases and organize how you store your data. You can also use the Studio environment to administer the users and permissions for the database access. And of course, from SQL Studio, you can actually write your SQL queries to perform the operations on the data that you need. So now let's discuss the bread and butter of this webinar. What is the AVEVA Edge SQL Connection? Well, first, to understand it, we need to understand what a SQL relational database is. It's a set of information stored in tables with fields and registers. It supports SQL commands that allow the user to easily manipulate, sort through, or extract data from these tables. Edge actually has the native capability to interface with the SQL relational databases. By doing so, you can easily share alarms, events, or trends between Edge and the SQL database. And this works both ways because once the connection is established, you can actually retrieve data from the SQL database to Edge, in addition to sending data from Edge to the SQL database. However, it doesn't typically make a lot of sense to use the SQL database to write to Edge. Usually you're extracting historical data from Edge into your SQL database, but it does work both ways. It is really convenient because you don't actually need to worry about the specific characteristics of the SQL database. The database provider feature inside of Edge that you can easily configure does the heavy lifting for you. As you can see, as you will see in this webinar, the setup is fairly straightforward. So why is the Edge SQL connection important and why do you care about it? Well, the short answer is that it gives you more flexibility and control with your data than just using the data inside of Edge does. By configuring the SQL connection and creating a database inside of SQL Studio, you're essentially scaling up the way that you can share your data. By default, AVEVA Edge stores its data in a proprietary format that you can find in the HST files. This helps the software run in an efficient manner, but it can get in the way of allowing the software to share its data with outside sources. In contrast, storing your historical data from Edge to a SQL database unlocks your ability to leverage the SQL language, which is great because, as you know, SQL is a very rich and robust method for extracting data, and it's also the industry standard. So with this solution, Edge can provide data in a SQL database that you can easily share with other data management systems like MySQL, MS Access, Oracle, Informix, etc. And Edge also has built-in database and ERP functions that you can use to interact with these external databases even further. And the way these commands work is that they essentially mimic SQL coding language, and you can use them to perform operations on your SQL databases all from Edge, and even extract certain pieces of information back from those databases back to Edge, depending on the particular function. If we have time today, we can talk a little bit about how this type of scripting works. So anyway, that wraps up the introductory PowerPoint presentation. So let's go ahead and hop into my VM environment to showcase how the Edge SQL connection is configured and what you can do with it. So give me a second, guys. I'm going to go ahead and share my VM. Okay, so I'm sharing my VM environment. I know the participants are muted here, so Annie, can you see my VM?
Yes, I can.
Awesome. So let's go ahead and get started, guys. In this architecture, I'm actually going to be working with AVEVA Edge 2020 R2 SP1 and SQL Server 2019. But keep in mind that this functionality is also supported by previous versions of Edge or Indusoft and earlier versions of SQL Server. It also is supported by SQL Express too. So you're not limited by just using the full SQL Server environment. You can use SQL Express as well. So when it comes to setting up the SQL connection, there's generally 4 steps that are involved. The first one is, if you're using an optional SQL authentication mechanism, you want to configure the SQL Server with the appropriate security settings and also configure the SQL user, all in the SQL Server Studio. Then the next step is to create a database inside of SQL Server Studio. Then you want to restart the SQL Server to make sure that the changes are being effectuated. And the last step is to set up a database connection in AVEVA Edge 2020. So I actually already configured all of this, so I'm not going to be redoing any of these steps, but I will show you guys where to go to configure them. So I'll revisit kind of my steps without actually performing them. So like I said, the first step is, if you're using SQL authentication, is to create the user in SQL Studio and then set up the appropriate security settings. So let's open up the SQL Server Management Studio here. I'm going to collapse everything to show you guys how to find them from scratch. So the first thing we're going to do is right-click on our node here and then click on Properties. And inside of the Security tab here, we're going to make sure that SQL Server and Windows Authentication mode is selected. By default, only Windows Authentication mode is selected. So we want to make sure that the second option is selected here to enable the SQL Server Authentication mode. I won't actually be using SQL Server Authentication mode in this particular example in the webinar today, but I wanted to show you guys how to enable it in case you wanted to do it to increase your security. So make sure that that is selected and click on OK. Windows Authentication works just as well here, but again, it just depends on the level of security that you want in your system. I chose Windows Authentication here for the sake of simplicity, but again, I'm going to show you guys how to do it with SQL Authentication mode as well. So because I'm using Windows Authentication, I don't actually need to create a specific user with the security settings. But if I were to do that, I would go inside of my node here expand the security folder right here. And inside of logins, I would right click and select new login. And in my case, I created a new login already. So I'm going to go ahead and open it to edit the properties. And when you would create a new login, if you were to use a SQL authentication right here, you would make sure to select SQL Server authentication, the second option, and then enter a password. So this is where you're creating your login credentials for this particular user, that if you have SQL authentication enabled for this database connection, you would need these login credentials to log in. Once that's done, we're going to go over to server roles and make sure that the sysadmin box is checked off right here. And then we also want to make sure that in the status tab right here, the login option is enabled, not disabled, to make sure that it works correctly. So now that we have the right security settings and the user created, we can go ahead and actually add our database. Again, I already added it right here. But if you were to add one to work through this process from scratch, you would right click on database and click on new database. And I wanted to show you guys the different options here when it comes to creating a database. There's a lot of different choices here on how you can fine tune it, but in my case, I kept all these options defaults for simplicity's sake. This is just a default database that I'm using, so I'm not going to actually edit any of these settings. So all I did was add a new database. I named it EdgeDB so I can find it easily, and then I left all these settings default here for simplicity's sake. So at this stage, if you were to use SQL authentication and use that user that we added called Edge, you would need to make sure that the right roles are assigned to that user and that you give the Edge user the right access privileges to the Edge database. So to do that, you want to go back to your Edge user and go to the user mapping tab. Check the new row that would populate here since we added a new database. This is the Edge database. Make sure that is checked and that the DB owner box is checked for this particular user. So this gives the right permissions to the Edge user to control this Edge database as a DB owner. So we're going to go ahead and click on OK. And that pretty much wraps up the configuration settings that you need to set up inside of your SQL Server Management Studio to make this work. Now, in order to actually, enforce these changes and effectuate them, you would need to restart your SQL Server, which actually requires you to not only, close out the Management Studio, but actually go into your services and restart the server itself. So what I did is I searched for SQL Server Configuration Manager, opened up this program right here. You want to select SQL Server Services on the left, and then select the main SQL Server service, which is MS SQL Server right here. If you were using SQL Express, it would be called SQL Express instead of Microsoft SQL Server. And then you would right click, stop it, wait for it to stop, and then start it again. So I'm not actually going to restart it here because I don't want to break the link that I already have created, and I didn't actually make any changes. I just showed you guys how to go through and change the security settings that I already had created beforehand. But if you were to do this from scratch, you would restart it right here to make sure that the changes are effectuated. This is a common pitfall and is a crucial step. I've seen customers use this Edge SQL connection and be stuck because it's not working, and that's because they didn't actually restart the SQL Server service. So this is very important. So now we can actually move on to the final step in the configuration process, which is setting up the database connection in AVEVA Edge 2020. So let's go ahead and open up AVEVA Edge 2020 right here. So the first thing you want to do is go to the ribbon up on top and select Project. And in the Project tab, we're going to select the Options folder. Inside of the Options folder, we're going to select default database. And oh yeah, if you get this error message right here, it means that your runtime it still thinks that your runtime is open. I actually closed my runtime by pressing the X to close out the window, but it didn't properly close it. To properly close it, you actually need to press on the stop button right here. So I'm going to press on the stop button to make sure that my runtime modules are closed. Go back to my options folder and default database. Now, the first thing you'll see here is you can choose whether to make this a primary database or secondary. You can have redundant databases, right? In my case, I'm just going to leave it as primary for simplicity's sake. And then you want to go ahead and fill in the connection string by clicking on the ellipse on the right side. This connection string specifies which database to connect to. So it's a really important step here. And the first thing you're going to do when you click on the ellipse to specify the connection string is go to the provider tab on the left and make sure you have Microsoft OLE DB provider for SQL Server selected. So this is this particular DB provider, right? And we're using SQL Server. So we want to make sure that this is the right one that's selected. And then we're going to click on next. And now in the connection tab, by default, your local server name will populate right here. And you can select a different server name, right? If you have, different machines on the same network, for example, and your SQL Server Management Studio is on a different node, this is where you would specify the different node name. But in my case, it's just on the same VM. So this is the local node that I'm using here. So you want to make sure that you're pointing to the correct SQL Server. In step 2, if you were to use, and this is where you specify if you want to use Windows NT integrated security or use SQL authentication. So in my case, I'm using the Windows NT integrated security. So I'm going to keep this first one selected. But if you were to use SQL authentication, this is where you would check the second option and then enter the login credentials. So for that Edge user that we previously created inside of SQL Server Management Studio, this is where you would enter that Edge user login credentials to make it work if you were to use SQL authentication mode. And then in the third step, you want to select the database on the server. So if you selected the right server name and the right security settings, then at that point you will see the different options populate of the different databases that are in the Server Management Studio here. So in my case, I'm using the Edge database that I've created previously. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure it's selected. And then I'm going to click on Test Connection. And at that point, you can see if the Edge environment can properly point towards your SQL Server Management Studio database. Then we're going to click on OK. And then we're going to go click on OK to go back to our previous screen here. And when I first select the default database option here, the connection string is empty, right? So actually going through these steps right here by clicking on the ellipse fills this in. So when I showed you guys earlier, it was already filled in. But if you were doing this from scratch, it would not be filled in. So after you go through these steps right here, you'll see this connection string populated for the first time. Now, this connection string, you can double check that everything works correctly because there's 4 components to it. The first one is the provider name. So in our case, it's SQL OLEDB1. That's the provider name that we had selected right here in this list. The second component is the integrated security. You want to make sure that it equals SSPI because we're using Windows NT security here. The next component is the initial catalog component, which essentially is the name of the database that you're pointing to. So in our case, it needs to equal EdgeDB. And the fourth component is the data source, which equals the node name where your SQL Server is hosted. So this is where I would double check and, after you enter the connection string and make sure that those 4 components are properly configured and properly populated inside the connection string. Because if one of them is wrong, then it won't work, right? So you have to make sure that these 4 components are inside of the connection string. So once you double check the string, you can go ahead and see that below it, you have another prompt for the username and passwords. This is where if you were to use SQL Authentication, once again, you would enter your Edge user login as well as the Edge user password if you were to use SQL Authentication, which I am not using in this case. So I'm going to go ahead and click on OK to close out that dialog box and click OK. And at this point, we are good to go. And our link is almost fully configured. There is one final step that's required. And again, this is a common pitfall as well. If you don't enter runtime after you configure your Edge SQL connection, your tables won't actually populate inside of SQL Server Studio. So at this point, we need to enter runtime. So here I am entering runtime in AVEVA Edge, and I'm going to leave runtime open here, do Alt-Tab to get out of it, and then navigate back to the Management Studio. And as you can see, my runtime is still active, right? I'm going to keep it active, but just hop over to Management Studio to show that the tables are properly being configured inside of your Edge database. So let's go ahead and expand our databases folder here, go to the EdgeDB, tables, and you can see here that there's 3 DBO tables at the bottom of the list. And that's how you know that your SQL connection is working, because initially when you create a database, these tables don't populate. They don't come in by default. So once the Edge SQL connection is established, these 3 tables are populated in here. So that's how you know that your data is being shared correctly from your Edge environment. So I chose to share 3 tables here: alarm history, event history, and Trend002. The alarm history and event history tables are pretty self-explanatory. They're essentially the alarms and events that were configured inside of my Edge project that are being shared. So if I go inside of my alarm history table right here and select the top 1,000 rows, for example, you'll see the results section right here inside of SQL Studio. These are the list of active alarms. So we can actually hop over to our Edge environment here and go to our tasks table or tasks tab inside the Project Explorer and open up our alarms list here. And you can see the different defined alarms here, right? We have industries_water.pressure and also the wind fault right here, turbine number 4, rotor side inverter overcurrent with, there's a typo in the inverter here. But if you hop back over to your Management Studio, you'll see these same alarms right here with the same typo in inverter, which is how you know this is coming from the right place. So these are the active alarms that are coming from Edge that are active. So as you can see, this proves that the Edge SQL connection is working properly, and the active alarms are actually being shared inside of the Edge SQL database. Now, I wanted to show you guys, besides the alarm history that's being shared, the Trend002 table specifically. Let's close out this one right here. Because I'm going to manipulate the data inside of Edge that is in this table to show you guys how it updates in real time, live, inside of the Edge database. So outside of the alarm history and event history, you can choose to share custom object data, such as trends within the SQL database. So I created a custom Trend002 called test right here. And I configured it to share with the SQL database. So if you open up the trend here and go to database configuration, this is where I configured it so it's actually sharing with that SQL database. So, I can uncheck use project default to confirm the connection string, but this is the same connection string, right? So just to confirm, this is pointing to the same Edge database that I specified inside of the options folder previously. Now, I checked use project default, so it populated automatically, but I can uncheck it to change it if I wanted to, or just to show you guys here that it's the same connection string. So because it's using the same connection string, and I have the use default name option checked as well as automatically create, it'll create Trend002 as a table inside of the Edge SQL database, which is why once the Edge SQL connection was established, this Trend002 table was populated here. And oh, one more thing. I had it set to save on trigger every second. So these tags here are sending their values to the Edge database, or the SQL database, sorry, every second. So we can actually go back to our Server Management Studio here and select the rows, the top 1000 rows, and see that there's 2 rows or 2 columns, one for the first tag, the other one for the second tag, that are populating in the values every single second. And I started this yesterday, so the top 1000 rows won't show the current values, but what we can actually do here is edit the SQL code up here. So instead of showing the top 1000 rows, let's go ahead and have it show all the rows. So you can do star from and execute, and this is going to show all the values. And so currently it's showing, you know, at this time that the values are 4 and 5, 4 for the industry food underscore level ID and 5 for the motor ID. And if we pop over to our Edge environment inside the watch table, you'll see that those are the values, right? And I can actually edit these live now. So let's change the level one to 8, for example, and the motor to 1. And inside this watch table, right, for you guys who are familiar with Edge, when you edit these values here, it actually updates and forces those values to change. So now our level value is 8 and our motor value is 1. So if I go back to my table, my database inside of Edge, inside of SQL Management Studio, and execute this query again, and actually I'm going to refresh it first, refresh the database, and we're going to execute this query again. You'll see that if I scroll all the way down to the most recent values, they changed to 8 and 1. And here's the second that they changed, which is right when I went into my Edge environment and forced those values to change. So this proves that the Edge SQL connection is updating live, right? Your data inside of Edge, your historical data, is being sent correctly to this SQL database right here. So it's 10:27, and that pretty much wraps it up. I know we only have a few minutes here, so I'm going to open up the floor to questions if anyone has any questions. I'm going to review the chat here. Austin, thank you for, Austin says, what an awesome Learn in 30, greatly appreciated. Thank you for the feedback, Austin. I'm glad you joined, and it sounds like it was helpful to you, so thank you for that feedback. So let's go ahead and review the Q&A here. Oh, I see, Austin, you have a few questions. How is SQL Server authentication more secure than Windows authentication? It's just, you know, more secure from the configuration side, right? So with Windows NT authentication, which is what I used, anyone can go in and change and configure that Edge SQL connection from within Edge. But if you're using SQL authentication, only the user inside of SQL that has the right security settings can use that. So it just gives you more control over who, you know, in your organization can actually configure that Edge SQL connection. Your second question is, wasn't this training for connecting a SQL Express database? What are the differences that we should be aware of? So this works for both SQL Express and the full SQL Studio environment. I showed it for, you know, the full SQL Server Management Studio, but if you were using SQL Express, the process is exactly the same. The only difference is that your node name would change from MS SQL Server to either MS SQL Express or SQL Express. So the process is exactly the same. It's just that some of the node name configurations are a little bit different. And your last question, Austin, was within the Edge project settings, data link properties, how do we connect to a cloud-based SQL server? That's a great question, actually. You know, I actually don't know for sure the answer to that question because I haven't done it myself. But I imagine that however your cloud-based SQL Server node name is configured or named, you would put in that name inside of the server node name. That's a great question because I haven't done it myself. I think that I'm not sure. I would need to look into these DB provider specifications, because this particular provider might not enable provisions for a cloud-based SQL Server. It might just be an on-premise SQL Server option. I'm not exactly sure. That's a great question, Austin. I would need to follow up and find out for you. But I think that, yeah, I think this provider would limit you to only the on-premise version of SQL Server and not a cloud-based version. And I don't see right off the bat a cloud SQL Server option here. Yeah, so I can find out for you, Austin, and let you know. So it's 10:30 here. There's no more open questions, but if anyone who's still here has any questions, feel free to ask. I'll hang around for a few more minutes.
We do have one more question in the chat, Pierre. They asked, can you talk about the save on trigger tag setup and how to prevent double D entries?
So Sid, are you referring to the save on trigger option that I had inside my trend?
Yes.
Yeah, awesome. So basically the way this works is you can set up these trend objects different ways. You can set them so that it saves on, you know, a particular trigger that can be just, so second right here is an internal tag that is just a clock, right? So every second. So by checking off this box, it saves on triggers. So every time this tag changes, which is every second. So this is the way for me to update the SQL database every second. There's also every minute, every hour. Those are the different internal tags that you can use that are the different clock options, right? So you can save it on a, you know, time basis. You can also enter a different tag, like really any tag that's in your project tag. So for example, I could enter, let's look for some different project tags here. I could enter, you know, really any of these tags. For example, there's an integer here, industries underscore food underscores level ID, and enter that as the save on trigger option, so that every time that tag changes, it will save these tag values into the SQL Server database. So it essentially saves them on the basis of whatever tag you have in here changing. Does that make sense? And the second part of your question is how to prevent double entries. So if you're right, so depending on your save on trigger, which, as I said, you can save on based on when a tag changes, or if the tag value itself changes, you could also do it that way, as opposed to it being based on an external trigger, right? A different tag or a clock. The SQL database will be updated based on that. So you may get double entries. So for example, if we save it on second here, right? Save on trigger second, and the tag value doesn't actually change every second, you'll get duplicate values, right? So for example, remember I changed it from 4 to 8 and 5 to 1 inside of the watch table. So the second that I updated that, you can see that these tag values changed inside of the SQL database. And after that, it keeps on saving the same tag values, because every second after that, it keeps refreshing, right? Because I have it set to save on trigger every second, but it didn't actually change any of these tag values after that. So you're going to get duplicate entries every second, just based on the nature of how I am sharing these values based on how I configured it inside the Trend002 object right here. But the beauty of, you know, exporting this to a SQL database like this is that at this point, I can actually write SQL code to filter this out any way I want to. And that's really the strength of this Edge SQL connection, is that now I can use SQL code to filter through this. So up here, you can write queries and, you know, manipulate this database to filter it out any way you see fit. So to answer your question is, it can, you know, submit duplicate entries depending on how you have it set up inside of Edge and how you're sharing the data. But you can manipulate that inside of Edge so that it doesn't do duplicate entries depending on how you want to set it up. But if it does, you can, you know, filter that further inside of your SQL Studio environment by writing the SQL code for it. And then your other question is how to get data from SQL data into Edge. So I didn't really, it's 10:35, but I can talk about this a little bit. I didn't really talk about the scripting too much, but you can actually do some scripting inside of Edge to extract data from an external database in SQL back to Edge. And you do that by using database ERP functions. And what they are is they're commands inside of Edge that emulate SQL coding language so that you can perform operations inside of your SQL database from Edge. So I don't really have time to show you that scripting entirely in action, but I can show you where to find that information. So if you go inside of your Edge environment and then go to your help files, and if we type in list of available functions, and then select them right here, you'll see a section for database ERP functions. So I can select one of them. And as I said, these are functions that can be used to interact with external databases, like your SQL relational database that you created, and also ERP systems. And it uses SQL-like commands from within Edge. So if we pick db execute, for example, it executes a custom SQL statement on an external database. And if the statement is a query, like select, the database values are copied to specific arrayed tags. So this allows you to use, built-in scripting functions inside of Edge to manipulate those SQL database further, those external databases. But also you can extract certain pieces of information back to Edge from them. So that's what I meant when I mentioned earlier that it works both ways, right? Typically, it's only, most situations only call for doing it one way, extracting your historical data from Edge to your SQL database. But sometimes you might want to get some information back from your SQL database, and these scripts allow you to do that. So for example, this particular db execute, function allows you to copy the database values back to specific array tags inside of Edge if the statement is a query. So it just depends on the specific type of function. But like I said, it works both ways. So you can use these to extract certain pieces of information back to Edge from SQL database.